In 1943, no region in Europe symbolized German industrial power more completely than the Ruhr. It was a landscape of endless smokestacks, coal mines, steel mills, chemical plants, and rail networks, a vast interconnected machine that supplied nearly every corner of Hitler's war effort. To Allied planners, the Ruhr was not just important, it was the beating heart of the Third Reich, the single most valuable target outside of Berlin itself. Inside this dense industrial web stood factories producing almost half of Germany's coal, 40% of its steel, and critical components for tanks, aircraft, armor plate, and munitions. The furnaces of the Ruhr fed the front lines from Stalingrad to Tunisia. Without the Ruhr, Germany's armies would starve for fuel, ammunition, and machinery. And yet this enormous production engine relied on a single, often overlooked resource: water. The Ruhr dams, the Marne, Eder, and Sorpe, were more than simple engineering structures. They controlled the water supply that powered hydroelectric stations, regulated canal traffic, cooled industrial furnaces, and fed the manufacturing plants that operated day and night. Their reservoirs stored millions of tons of water. Their turbines generated electricity for hundreds of miles around. And their presence allowed factories to run at peak output even during dry seasons. British intelligence had recognized the importance of these dams as early as 1940. A single successful breach could flood the Ruhr Valley, halt transportation, drown power stations, wash away bridges, and force steel mills and chemical plants offline. Two breaches could potentially paralyze the entire region, but targeting them posed an almost impossible problem. The dams were modern fortifications. The Marne Dam alone was over 40 meters high, built with interlocked concrete blocks designed to resist heavy bombardment. Standard bombs could not penetrate its structure. High-altitude attacks had already been attempted, but bombs dropped from 15,000 feet scattered across the countryside without causing significant damage. At low level, the dams were protected by torpedo nets stretching across the reservoirs. Even if a bomb hit the water, it would detonate harmlessly before reaching the wall. By early 1943, the Air Ministry had accepted an uncomfortable truth. No existing weapon in the British arsenal could destroy the Ruhr dams, yet the need had never been greater. After years of brutal German bombing, British cities were shattered, and morale was fragile. The Allies were searching for a dramatic victory, one that would cripple German industry and revive public confidence. Churchill himself believed that a decisive blow to the Ruhr could shorten the war. Into this urgent problem stepped an engineer whose imagination had always outpaced conventional thinking: Barnes Wallis. Wallis understood that brute force alone could not break the dams, but he also knew that water was both a shield and a weapon. If a bomb could reach the base of the dam, below the surface, water pressure itself could amplify the blast enough to crack the concrete from within. It was a radical idea, one that many dismissed as impossible. But Wallace believed he had found a way: a bomb that would skip across the surface like a stone, bounce over the torpedo nets, and strike the dam at the precise depth needed to break it apart. Operation Chastise would become one of the most daring and innovative missions of the war. And its story began here, with the realization that Germany's strongest defenses concealed their greatest weakness: water could save the Ruhr. But water, if turned against them, could also destroy it. Barnes Wallis was not a soldier, nor a pilot, nor a man shaped by battlefield experience. He was an engineer, methodical, imaginative, and often restless. By early 1943, he had spent years searching for a way to strike Germany in a manner that would change the course of the war. His answer came not from the sky, but from physics, hydrodynamics, and a deep understanding of how structures behave when attacked below the surface. Wallace knew the Ruhr dams could not be destroyed by conventional bombing. He reviewed the earlier attempts with clinical precision. High-altitude bombing had been useless. Bombers flew too high to achieve accuracy, and the dam's thick concrete walls simply absorbed the shock of any near miss. Torpedo nets eliminated underwater attacks entirely. No matter how many bombs the RAF dropped, the dams remained untouched. Instead of searching for a bigger bomb, Wallace searched for a smarter one. His breakthrough came while studying naval gunnery reports. He observed how depth charges produce far greater structural damage when detonating underwater near a ship's hull compared to an external explosion. Water amplified the force. A bomb exploding at exactly the right depth against a dam could transfer several times more energy into the structure than a surface blast. The challenge was delivering such a weapon past the torpedo nets that protected the reservoir. The solution was radical: make the bomb skip across the water like a stone. If the weapon were given backspin, released at low altitude and exact speed, it would bounce across the reservoir surface, leap over the torpedo net barriers, strike the dam wall, and sink down before detonation. Wallace imagined a cylindrical, rotating bomb released at 60 feet above the water, traveling at 240 miles per hour, with precisely calibrated backspin. The spin would keep the bomb hugging the wall as it sank to the correct depth. But the idea seemed absurd to many in the Air Ministry. A skipping bomb, released at treetop height, by pilots flying at night? Yet Wallace persisted. He began testing small-scale prototypes on reservoirs and water tanks. Engineers watched as steel spheres and cylinders bounced across the surface exactly as Wallace predicted. The physics were undeniable, the concept worked, but convincing Bomber Command would require more than physics. It would require proof. Wallace approached senior RAF officials with mock-ups, diagrams, and film tests showing bombs jumping across the water in perfect arcs. Some were intrigued. Others dismissed the idea as too dangerous or too dependent on pilot skill. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of Bomber Command, was deeply skeptical. Harris favored mass bombing of German cities, not precision strikes requiring elite crews. Yet the strategic value of breaching the Ruhr dams was too great to ignore. The Ministry of Aircraft Production authorized full-scale trials. By early 1943, Wallace was testing larger prototypes at Reculver on the English coast. These early bombs, codenamed High Ball and Upkeep, were enormous spinning cylinders that smashed into the sea with thunderous force. Engineers hid from flying debris. Observers watched as bombs skimmed across the waves, struck target structures, and detonated underwater. The concept worked. Now came the next challenge: creating an aircraft and a squadron capable of deploying the weapon. The Avro Lancaster was chosen for its long range, heavy payload, and stable handling at low altitude. But even the Lancaster needed heavy modifications. The bomb bay had to be completely rebuilt to accommodate the rotating cylinder. Motors were installed to generate the necessary backspin. New aiming systems were added, simple but brilliant solutions like triangulated spotlights to measure altitude at exactly 60 feet. Pilots would have to fly at night, through enemy territory at dangerously low levels. They would need extraordinary precision. That meant finding extraordinary airmen. The RAF began assembling an elite hand-picked squadron for the mission, number 617 Squadron, soon to become one of the most legendary units in British history. Its leader would be a calm, disciplined, and fiercely respected Canadian. Wing Commander Guy Gibson, a man with over 170 combat missions already behind him. The pieces were falling into place. A weapon that shouldn't exist, an aircraft modified beyond recognition, and a squadron trained for a mission that seemed closer to imagination than reality. Operation Chastise was no longer an idea. It was becoming a plan. By March 1943, Barnes-Wallis's revolutionary weapon existed not only on paper, but in full steel form. The bomb had a name, Upkeep. The aircraft had been selected, the Avro Lancaster. But there remained one element without which Operation Chastise could not exist: the men who would deliver the weapon. These would not be ordinary bomber crews. They needed to be exceptional, calm under pressure, precise to the point of perfection, and fearless enough to fly at 60 feet in the dark over occupied Europe. To build this unit, the RAF created an entirely new squadron, number 617 Squadron, stationed at RAF Scampton. Its commander was the young but already legendary Wing Commander Guy Gibson. At only 24 years old, he carried a reputation few in Bomber Command could match. He had flown more than 170 missions, survived night fighter patrols, and earned the Distinguished Service Order and Distinguished Flying Cross. His men said he possessed two qualities rare among commanders: relentless discipline and complete fearlessness. The airmen arrived at Scampton without knowing why they had been selected. Many assumed they were being prepared for some new experimental bombing method. Others suspected a secret mission, but none imagined that their target would be the most heavily protected dams in Europe. All they knew was that they were expected to master a form of flying that bordered on the impossible. Training began at once, and it quickly became clear that 617 Squadron was unlike any other. Instead of practicing high-altitude bombing, crews were ordered to fly at treetop level, sometimes as low as 50 or 60 feet. They trained over reservoirs, lakes, and coastal waters. Learning how to hold altitude with absolute precision, even a few feet too high or too low, would cause the bouncing bomb to strike the surface at the wrong angle. RAF engineers installed two converging spotlights beneath each Lancaster's fuselage, angled so the beams met at exactly 60 feet above the water. If the beams touched, the pilot was too low. If they remained separate, he was too high. This simple but brilliant system became essential for nighttime accuracy. At the same time, the bomb aimers were drilled in a new method of target approach. Because upkeep had to be dropped at a precise distance from the dam, a special wooden triangular sight was developed. When the dam's towers aligned perfectly with the edges of the sight, the bomber was at the correct release point. It was an improvised tool, but it worked. The crews trained relentlessly. Lancaster engines roared across English lakes at dawn and dusk, sending ripples across the water. Local fishermen complained residents near the training sites wondered why RAF bombers were flying so dangerously low. But secrecy was absolute. Even among themselves, the pilots did not discuss details of the mission, and the training was dangerous. More than once, Lancasters clipped the water with their wingtips. On one flight, a bomber struck a power line and returned to base with half its tail missing. Yet Gibson tolerated no hesitation. He made it clear, only crews capable of the strictest discipline would be permitted to fly the mission. The squadron's atmosphere grew increasingly intense. Mechanics worked long days modifying aircraft with the distinctive bomb cradles and spinning motors. Pilots reviewed maps again and again, memorizing river valleys, reservoir shapes, and approach routes they had never flown before. Wireless operators learned to navigate without radio signals. To avoid German detection, gunners practiced nighttime spotting, scanning for flak bursts and searchlights. Still, no one knew the target. Finally, in early May, the men were assembled in Scampton's briefing hall. The room fell silent as officers rolled out a massive map of Germany. The red circles drawn across the Ruhr left no doubt. The mission was to destroy the Marne, Eder, and Sorpe dams. The silence lasted several seconds. Then the room came alive with questions. How low must we fly? What about anti-aircraft fire? What if the bomb fails to bounce? Gibson raised his hand. This mission, he said, is dangerous. Many of us will not return. But if we succeed, we strike at the very heart of German industry. With that, the training, the secrecy, and the speculation crystallized into a single, audacious goal. 617 Squadron knew what they had been chosen for, and there was no turning back. As April 1943 turned into May, the pressure surrounding Operation Chastise grew heavier with each passing day. The weapon existed, the squadron was trained, but none of it mattered unless the bomb itself worked under combat conditions. Every flaw, every miscalculation, every second of error would be fatal. Not just to the weapon's success, but to the crews who would fly into the Ruhr at night. The upkeep bomb was still a prototype in all but name. The final version weighed over 9,000 pounds. So heavy that even the mighty Lancaster required extensive reinforcement to carry it. Engineers removed the bomb doors entirely, built a new external cradle, and installed a massive electric motor underneath the fuselage to spin the bomb at 500 revolutions per minute. The motor alone drew so much current that flight engineers had to recalculate power distribution throughout the aircraft. Testing began at the Reculver Range on the Kent coast. Wallace stood beside military observers, watching through binoculars as early prototypes were released from modified Lancasters. The first drops were disastrous. Some bombs skipped too early, bouncing erratically and slamming into the sea with violent force. Others skipped too late and struck the target structures with the wrong angle. Failing to maintain contact, one bomb even shattered on impact, spraying fragments across the test area. But with each failure, Wallace refined the design. He altered the casing thickness, adjusted the spin rate, modified the release height, and worked with ground crews to calculate a precise launch speed, 240 miles per hour. No more and no less. The Lancaster pilots practiced the approach repeatedly, flying lower and lower until their propellers seemed to slice the spray from the waves. By late April, the tests were improving. Bombs skipped consistently across the water, hitting the wooden markers placed to simulate dam walls. When they struck, they hugged the surface, rolled down the face, and detonated underwater with immense force. Observers reported shock waves powerful enough to send geysers of water 40 meters into the air. Yet there were still setbacks. During one test, the bomb struck the water too hard and smashed a section of the Lancaster's underside. The aircraft limped back to base, barely able to maintain altitude. Another time, a spinning prototype broke loose during taxiing, forcing the ground crew to dive for cover. Even the smallest mechanical failure could result in catastrophe. Despite the risks, morale in 617 Squadron remained high. Pilots and bombardiers watched the tests from the shoreline, studying the rhythm and timing of each bomb's path. They understood how narrow their margin for error truly was. A few feet too high or too low, a few miles per hour too fast or too slow, and the entire mission would fail. Guy Gibson insisted on running the squadron like a finely tuned machine. He drilled his crews relentlessly. Night flights at low altitude, water skimming maneuvers, synchronized approaches. Lancaster teams became intimately familiar with the upkeep's behavior, even though most had never seen the bomb explode in person. They trusted Wallace's calculations because their lives depended on them. Meanwhile, at the Ministry of Aircraft Production, debates continued over whether the mission should proceed. Some officials considered the concept too risky, too experimental, too dependent on flawless execution, but time was running out. Heavy spring rains had filled the Ruhr reservoirs to maximum capacity. If the dams were breached now, the flood damage would be catastrophic. If the mission was delayed, water levels would fall and the effect would diminish. On May 13th, the final full-scale test was performed. A Lancaster roared toward the Reculver range, engines screaming at full power. The upkeep bomb dropped, skipped 3 perfect arcs across the water, struck the test structure exactly where Wallace predicted, and detonated in a massive underwater plume. When the spray cleared, the observers knew the weapon worked. That evening, Wallace presented his final report. Every calculation confirmed the same conclusion. The upkeep bomb was ready, not perfect, not safe, but ready enough to send into combat. The next step would no longer be training or testing, it would be war. Word spread quickly across RAF Scampton. Mechanics worked through the night loading live upkeep bombs onto the Lancaster's ground. Crews tightened bolts, inspected engines, tested the spinning mechanisms again and again. Pilots held brief final rehearsals, tracing the dam approach in their minds until every contour felt familiar. Operation Chastise was no longer an experiment. It was a mission, and in a matter of hours, 617 Squadron would carry the weapon into the heart of Germany. The afternoon of May 16, 1943, settled over RAF Scampton with a tense quietness that felt unnatural. The airfield was normally full of noise. Engines warming, mechanics shouting, ground crews moving bomb trolleys. But today everything seemed muted, as if the entire station understood the gravity of what was coming. The crews of 617 Squadron had trained for weeks without knowing the target, perfecting techniques that pushed their Lancasters to their limits. Now the secrecy would finally end. Shortly after 5 p.m., squadron members were summoned to the main briefing hall. They arrived in small groups: pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, wireless operators, gunners, each man carrying the heavy silence of anticipation. When the doors closed, Wing Commander Guy Gibson stepped forward. He spoke with the calm intensity of a man who understood he was sending many of his closest comrades into a mission from which they might not return. Behind him, officers rolled down a massive map covering the Ruhr Valley. For the first time, the air crews saw their objective: the Marne, Eder, and Sorpe dams. A murmur spread through the room. Some men leaned forward, others sat back stunned. They had guessed at many targets: bridges, U-boat pens, docks. But no one expected the dams. Gibson's voice remained steady. If we breach these dams, the effect on German industry will be devastating. This mission can shorten the war. But make no mistake, this will be one of the most dangerous operations ever attempted. He explained the plan in meticulous detail. 3 attacking waves would depart. Formation 1, led by Gibson, would strike the Marne Dam. Formation 2 would move to the Eder Dam. Formation 3 would attempt the Sorpe Dam if the first cruise were unsuccessful. The approach routes were treacherous. To avoid German radar, the Lancasters would fly at less than 100 feet across the North Sea. Once over Holland, they would have to dodge power lines, windmills, church steeples, and unexpected ground fire. If a Lancaster climbed even slightly, searchlights or flak batteries would pick it out instantly. Low altitude was protection, but also the greatest danger. The risks were clear. Hit a tree and the plane would break apart. Strike the water and the aircraft would disintegrate. Take a direct hit from flak and no one would survive the impact. Then came the description of the attack run. The bombers had to approach the dams at 240 miles per hour at exactly 60 feet of altitude, using only converging spotlights and a simple triangular sight to judge distance. The upkeep bomb would spin beneath the fuselage, vibrating the aircraft. The slightest deviation could cause the bomb to ricochet wildly or fail to reach the wall. As Gibson spoke, some men took notes. Others simply stared at the map, committing every contour of the valleys and reservoirs to memory. The navigators began visualizing the path: forests, rivers, railroad lines, villages, and shadows where flak batteries might wait. The bomb aimers studied diagrams of the dam towers, understanding where that single moment of release would decide success or failure. When the briefing ended, the room remained silent for several long seconds. The men knew what this mission meant, not only tactically but symbolically. If successful, they would strike the most daring blow of Bomber Command's history. If they failed, 617 Squadron might cease to exist in a single night. Gibson dismissed them with one final message: good luck, you will need it, and God be with you. Outside, the setting sun cast a deep golden light over the airfield. Mechanics were already preparing the Lancasters, swinging the enormous upkeep bombs into position and checking the motorized spin systems. Ground crews inspected every bolt, every cable, every control linkage, pushing fatigue aside. They knew that any mechanical fault might doom an entire crew. Inside the barracks, men wrote letters home, some cheerful, some somber. Others tried to sleep but could not. A few paced silently, rehearsing their tasks in their minds. Wireless operators tested their equipment again and again. Gunners cleaned their Brownings with unnecessary care, hands moving automatically. Navigators laid out maps under dim lights, tracing their fingers along the route. As darkness fell, the mission began to take shape in the cool evening air. Lancaster engines started turning one by one, each roar adding weight to the moment. The crews climbed aboard their aircraft with the solemnity of men stepping into history. The sky was clear, the reservoirs were full, the dams waited, and 617 Squadron was ready. At precisely 21:10 on May 16, 1943, the first Lancaster of 617 Squadron lifted off from RAF Scampton. Its engines roared against the evening sky as the massive aircraft accelerated down the runway. The upkeep bomb humming beneath its fuselage with the mechanical growl of its spinning motor. One by one, Gibson's formation followed, wheels leaving the earth for what every crewman knew could be his final mission. The night was moonlit, calm, and deceptively peaceful. But the moment the Lancasters cleared the base perimeter, they descended to an altitude no bomber was ever meant to fly, 150 feet, then 120, then 100, and finally 60 feet above the waves of the North Sea. At such heights, even a brief lapse of concentration could send a four-engine bomber crashing into the water with no hope of survival. The sea stretched out as a dark, endless expanse. The aircraft flew in tight formations, yet far enough apart to avoid disaster if one pilot misjudged altitude. Spray from the wave tops occasionally flicked against the bombers' bellies. The roar of the engines reverberated through the cockpit, through the fuselage, through the bones of every man aboard. Visibility was limited to what little moonlight reflected off the water. The Lancasters navigated using stopwatches, compass headings, and memorized timings. Radio silence was absolute. Any transmission might reveal their presence to German listening stations along the Dutch coast. Gibson led the formation with calm determination. Behind him, the crews settled into a focused rhythm. Navigators hunched over charts illuminated by faint red lights. Gunners scanned the horizon for enemy aircraft. Bomb aimers lay prone, eyes fixed ahead. The tension inside each aircraft was palpable, an unspoken understanding that every second brought them closer to danger. After nearly an hour over the North Sea, the coast of the Netherlands emerged from the darkness. A thin, glowing strip of land outlined by distant lights and the black silhouettes of defensive towers. This was the most dangerous transition point. German radar stations, searchlights, and anti-aircraft guns guarded the coastline heavily. The Lancasters, still flying dangerously low, approached quietly, hugging the contours of the shoreline. Gibson's aircraft cleared the dunes first. Immediately, the danger intensified. Windmills, church steeples, trees, and electrical pylons all became deadly obstacles. The Lancasters wove between them at speeds exceeding 230 miles per hour, their wings sometimes missing obstacles by mere feet. Navigators called out hazards at the last moment. Bank left! Pylon ahead! Climb! Climb! Each command delivered with clipped urgency. Several aircraft struck turbulence caused by the transition from sea to land. A momentary loss of altitude meant disaster. One Lancaster hit the treetops, shearing leaves and branches that tore across the fuselage. Another barely missed a high-voltage cable. A third clipped the ground hard enough to shake loose equipment inside the bomb bay. Still, the formation pressed on as they penetrated deeper into occupied territory. German defenses grew denser. Searchlights probed the night sky, sweeping methodically for enemy aircraft. Anti-aircraft batteries dotted the landscape, though most were angled upward, expecting raiders at 10,000 feet. Not barely above the treetops, the Dambusters relied on this flaw in German doctrine. Low-level flying was their shield, but only so long as they remained invisible against the ground. Then came the first casualties. Flight Lieutenant Vernon's aircraft, flying too low while crossing the Dutch coast, struck high-voltage cables. The impact tore off part of the fuselage, sending the Lancaster crashing into a field in a violent explosion. There were no survivors. A second aircraft, commanded by Flight Lieutenant Astle, hit the ground after misjudging a rising slope. The bomber disintegrated instantly, scattering debris across the countryside. Inside the remaining aircraft, the crews felt each loss like a physical blow. They could see the flames behind them, They could see the blackened plume rising into the night, but they had no time to dwell. The mission required absolute focus. Now the Lancasters approached the twisting valleys and riverbeds that led toward the Ruhr. Navigators guided their pilots along winding paths, using bridges, rail lines, and the silver-gray glint of rivers as reference points. Each new ridge, each bend in the terrain, brought the threat of enemy flak. And though the bombers were nearly skimming the ground, many German gunners spotted them anyway, opening fire with quick bursts of tracer that streaked across the night sky. Some gunners fired too high, confused by the altitude. Others corrected quickly and sent deadly streams of fire into the Lancasters' path. Gibson's aircraft dodged several bursts, the tracers whipping past the cockpit like fiery needles. But through it all, the crews pressed on. They had trained for this moment, for this mad, low-level dash through enemy territory at night with a weapon the world had never seen before. Every second was a test of skill, discipline, and nerve. Ahead lay the Ruhr Valley. Ahead lay the reservoirs. Ahead lay the German dams, silent, massive, and completely unaware that a squadron of bombers was racing toward them at wave-top height, bearing a weapon designed to tear their concrete hearts apart. 617 Squadron had survived the sea, the coast, and the first wave of flak. Now came the attack itself. The night was only beginning. The surviving Lancasters crossed deeper into Germany, leaving behind the chaotic flak belts of the Dutch border. The terrain now shifted into rolling farmland and dark forested hills. Every minute brought 617 Squadron closer to their target, the Great Marne Dam, one of the most guarded structures in the Ruhr. But as they approached, the challenge intensified. The valley leading to the dam formed a natural funnel, forcing the bombers into an even narrower, more predictable attack corridor. The reservoirs ahead were concealed by darkness. The crews could see almost nothing, only the faint reflection of starlight rippling across the surface of the lakes. The bomb aimers, lying at the nose of each aircraft, pressed their eyes against the perspex windows, searching desperately for the first glimpse of concrete. Gibson, still leading the formation, constantly checked his stopwatch and map. Every landmark had been memorized. A small cluster of houses, a railway line, a winding road, the bend of a river. The valleys of central Germany were treacherous, rising and falling in unpredictable patterns. The Lancasters had to adjust altitude every few moments to avoid crashing into unseen ridges. Then at last, a shimmering band of reflected water appeared ahead, the Marne Reservoir. Even in darkness, the silhouette of the hills around it created a distinct black outline against the night sky. Gibson's heart quickened. They were close. The Marne Dam itself, however, remained invisible. Thick layers of mist drifted across the lake, absorbing the light from the moon and obscuring the far shore. The bombers dropped even lower, now skimming only a few dozen feet above the reservoir surface. Every pilot knew that the approach path to the dam had been calculated to the meter. The upkeep bomb required a perfect run-in. Speed, 240 miles per hour, altitude 60 feet, distance to release point, exactly 425 yards. Anything less precise, and the spinning mine would bounce wildly across the water or strike a dam wall at the wrong angle, rendering the mission a complete failure. The crews prepared. Engineers switched on the bomb's motor, bringing the cylindrical weapon up to its required 500 revolutions per minute. The plane vibrated with the spinning force of the upkeep, a constant reminder of the deadly payload they carried. A sudden burst of light flashed in the distance. German defenses' searchlights from towers along the reservoir flicked on, their beams slicing through fog like long white blades. The piercing light swept the lake's surface, hunting for intruders. Within seconds, the entire valley erupted in illumination. Additional searchlights ignited on the dam itself, and the surrounding hills reflected the glow. The crews of 617 Squadron were now exposed. There was no hiding. German gunners opened fire immediately. Twin-barreled 20-millimeter flak guns, positioned around the dam, began firing upward in jagged bursts. The tracers arced across the night sky, ricocheting off the water or exploding in bright flashes that lit the Lancasters from below. The crews could hear the metallic hammering of flak shells tearing through the air. Gibson made the first move. He pushed his Lancaster down even further, hugging the lake's surface to slip beneath the searchlight beams. The aircraft skimmed so close that the bomb aimer could see the spray rising from the winger tips. Behind him, the other bombers followed suit, executing the same daring maneuver. The attack run was beginning, but the valley presented another deadly challenge. Towering hills positioned directly behind the dam. To begin their attack, each Lancaster would have to fly directly toward these black masses of rock, then call for a steep climb immediately after releasing the bouncing bomb. Missing the hills by only a few seconds inside the cockpits, tension mounted. Each man felt the full weight of the moment. Training was over. This was the real attack. As Gibson made his final pre-attack checks, his bomb aimer finally saw it. A vast, dark shape emerging from the fog. An enormous wall of stone rising out of the water. The Marne Dam. More flak fire erupted from the towers, now aimed directly at their altitude tracers, whipped in front of the cockpit canopy like glowing razor wires. The gunners returned sporadic fire, but their primary role was survival, not suppression. Gibson reached for the intercom. "Stand by. This is it." The Lancaster surged forward into the attack run. Behind him, each aircraft in the formation prepared to follow, one by one, into the Valley of Death, where every man knew that even the smallest mistake would lead to certain destruction. The Marne Dam was in sight. Its destruction, or their deaths, lay just moments ahead. The valley around the Marne Dam had become a furnace of light and fire. Searchlights raked the sky, flak bursts erupted across the reservoir, and the roar of Merlin engines echoed off the hills. Into this chaos flew Wing Commander Guy Gibson, determined to deliver the first attack and draw enemy fire away from the bombers behind him. Gibson steadied his Lancaster, dropping to exactly 60 feet above the water. His bomb aimer, Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood, lay prone in the nose, gripping the bomb release trigger. The upkeep mine rotated beneath them at 500 revolutions per minute, its hum vibrating through the aircraft. Every second mattered. As Gibson crossed the reservoir, the light intensified. Beams converged on the Lancaster like spears of white fire. The German gunners had found their range. Tracers streaked across the cockpit, some passing so close they illuminated Gibson's face with bursts of orange light. But he did not break formation. He held the line, trusting the training that had brought them this far. At 425 yards from the dam, Hopgood's aimers shouted into the intercom, "Bomb! Bomb!" Gibson triggered the release. The Lancaster jolted upward as the massive spinning bomb dropped away. The upkeep struck the surface with a tremendous splash, then bounced one perfect skip. A second, A third. The spinning cylinder struck the dam wall, sank, and detonated in a deep underwater explosion. A plume of water rose hundreds of feet into the air. But when the spray settled, the dam still stood. Its massive stone structure held firm, scarred but unbroken. Gibson pulled up sharply, climbing toward the hills behind the dam. Flak fire followed him, but his maneuver had succeeded. Every gun in the valley had locked onto his aircraft. This opened a brief window for the next bomber. Hopgood's Lancaster came in second. His plane had been damaged earlier in the mission, and the flak had only grown more intense. The crew fought to maintain level flight as they approached the release point. Hopgood's bomb aimer shouted the call. "Bomb gone!" But the Lancaster had been too low, too fast. The upkeep bounced violently and exploded prematurely. The aircraft flew directly through the blast. It was torn apart. Hopgood attempted to gain altitude, trying desperately to save his men. Only 2 crew members survived the fiery crash on the far side of the valley. The rest died in the attempt. Gibson, circling above, watched in horror, but he had no time to mourn. The mission had to continue. The third bomber, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Mick Martin, entered the valley next. Martin's plane skillfully hugged the water, his low-level flying so precise that the rear gunner later claimed he could see individual ripples of the reservoir. Martin lined up the shot perfectly. His bomb released cleanly, bounced across the surface, and struck the dam. But the explosion caused only minor damage. The Marne Dam remained unbroken. The German defenders, realizing the attack pattern, increased their fire. A flak battery on the eastern tower focused on the next incoming aircraft. Bullets slammed into the Lancaster's fuselage, punching holes in the wings, shattering perspex, and wounding crew members. But the plane stayed airborne. Then came Flight Lieutenant David Maltby in Lancaster. AJJ. Maltby had performed some of the most precise practice runs during training, and now it showed he entered the valley at the exact altitude, exact speed, and exact angle required. Maltby's bomb aimer made his final adjustments and called, "Steady, steady, now." The bomb dropped. It struck the water at the perfect spot, skipped 3 times, and rolled directly into the base of the dam, exactly where Barnes-Wallis had intended it to go. The underwater explosion that followed was unlike the others. The dam shuddered visibly. Cracks formed along its face. A deep rumbling vibrated through the valley. And then, the Marne Dam gave way. A colossal section of stone collapsed inward. A wall of water, hundreds of millions of tons, burst through the breach. The torrent surged down the valley with the force of a natural disaster. Farms, villages, bridges, and power stations were swallowed in seconds. Gibson, circling overhead, watched the breach widen. The mission's primary objective had been achieved. A dam that had stood for decades, fortified, engineered, and guarded, had been broken in a single night by a squadron of young airmen flying at treetop height. As the roar of cascading water echoed through the valley, Gibson radioed to the squadron. "The Marne is down. Target destroyed." But the mission was far from over. 2 more dams still awaited attack, and the surviving crews now had to repeat the entire process. Again flying into flak, again facing death, again placing complete trust in a weapon that had never before been used in combat. The night was just beginning. With the Marne Dam finally broken, the valley behind it filling with a roaring cascade of water, the surviving bombers of 617 Squadron now turned toward their next target, the massive Eder Dam. Unlike the Mona, the Eder did not supply the Ruhr's industrial center directly with cooling water. Instead, it fed the Weser River basin and helped regulate vast waterways essential for transportation, electrical generation, and military logistics. Breaking it would send another destructive wave across Germany and amplify the chaos already unfolding across the region. But reaching the Eder Dam posed a far greater challenge than the Mona. The surrounding terrain was a natural fortress. The dam sat deep within a narrow valley encircled by steep forested hills. Unlike the flat, open reservoir of the Marne, the Eder was protected by ridgelines rising sharply on every side. The approach paths were so constrained that they forced attacking aircraft to fly a twisting series of turns at dangerously low altitude, maneuvers that Lancasters were never designed to perform. Even in daylight, a pilot would have struggled. At night, with only moonlight and instinct, it became a test of pure skill and nerve. Gibson, circling above the broken Mona reservoir, radioed the crews designated for the Eder attack. He sent Mick Martin ahead to lead the way, since Martin's flight skills were among the finest in the squadron. Behind him followed Flight Lieutenant Vernon Byers and Flight Lieutenant Les Knight, the men entrusted with delivering the bombs that might bring down the valley's next great dam. The route to the Eder began over rolling farmland, but quickly turned treacherous. The hills grew sharper, forming jagged silhouettes against the moonlit sky. The reservoirs and rivers below became impossible to distinguish from the shadows of the forests. The pilots had to rely entirely on the contour lines etched into their memorized maps. The strange silence struck the crews immediately. Unlike the Mona, the Eder Dam had no anti-aircraft defenses. A combination of terrain and German strategic assumptions had protected it. The valley's natural geography was considered impenetrable to enemy bombers. No flak guns, no searchlights, nothing. In Berlin, the Eder was believed invulnerable. Yet this same silence made the approach far more dangerous. Without searchlights, without snapshots of flak, without any geometry of enemy fire to guide them, the pilots had only their eyes and their instincts. The mountains rose without warning. Valleys appeared suddenly beneath them. The reservoir was nearly invisible until the very last moment Martin reached the area first. But the Eder refused to reveal itself. The moonlight was shifting, blocked by moving cloud, and the lake lay entirely in shadow. Several times Martin descended, searching for the water's reflection. Several times he pulled up sharply to avoid smashing into the unseen hills. The dam, when Martin finally spotted it, appeared almost ghost-like, a faint outline of curved stone rising from black water. The approach run, however, revealed itself to be nearly impossible. To attack the dam, a Lancaster had to swoop down a steep hillside, level out only meters above the lake, fly directly toward the wall, release the bomb with perfect precision, and then immediately climb sharply to avoid crashing into the opposite hillside. The valley left no room for error. One wrong turn, one misjudged angle, one gust of wind, and the aircraft and its crew would be gone. Still, the attack had to proceed. Martin made several practice runs, attempting to understand the valley's shape. Each time the aircraft strained against the tight turns, the wings trembling as they passed within meters of treetops. Martin's bomb aimer called out altitude changes, speed corrections, and alignment notes. But the upkeep bomb required a perfectly straight approach, and the valley barely offered one. After several unsuccessful attempts, Martin concluded that he could not make a safe bombing run. His crew agreed. They would orbit and wait for Knight, who followed closely behind Flight Lieutenant Less. Knight arrived moments later and immediately began evaluating the valley. Knight, calm and analytical, knew the run would demand absolute precision. Unlike Martin, Knight found a narrow approach line, a thread-like path between two hills that, if flown perfectly, could bring the Lancaster into the exact firing position. Knight began his own practice run. His aircraft dipped dangerously low, skimming the lake surface before pulling up steeply. The bomber's engines strained, the valley's walls flashing past the cockpit windows. Gibson, arriving overhead, monitored the attempts and eventually gave his approval. This would be the attack run. Knight lined up again. His Lancaster descended the hillside, leveled at precisely 60 feet, and roared toward the dam. The bomb aimer took control of the alignment, calling adjustments in rapid bursts. The upkeep mines spun beneath them, shaking the aircraft. For a moment, all the valley's silence returned, the stillness before impact. Then came the call. Release! Knight dropped the bomb. It struck the water cleanly and bounced in a perfect line toward the dam. The weapon struck the wall, sank, and detonated with a violent plume that shot upward into the night sky. When the spray subsided, cracks appeared along the stone surface. And then slowly but dramatically, the Eder Dam began to fail. The center section bulged, cracked further, and finally collapsed inwards. A surge of water thundered through the gap, racing down the valley in a twisting white torrent. 2 dams had now fallen in a single night. But the mission was not yet complete. The crew still had to escape Germany, and the flight home would be just as treacherous as the journey in. The Eder Dam had fallen. A second roaring torrent raced down a narrow German valley, carrying bridges, roads, farmlands, and entire villages in its path. For a moment, the air crews of 617 Squadron might have felt triumph. 2 of Germany's greatest dams, structures once considered invulnerable, had been destroyed in a single night by young men flying at treetop height. But victory did not mean survival. Now came the most dangerous phase of the mission, the return flight home. The Lancasters, scattered across central Germany after completing their attacks, had to navigate a maze of rising hills, rivers, forests, and flak zones, all while flying at low altitude to avoid radar detection. Their fuel reserves were critically low. Several aircraft were damaged, some crews were wounded, and every searchlight, every flak battery, every night fighter in Germany would now be on high alert after news of the dam breaches spread through Luftwaffe channels. Wing Commander Guy Gibson took charge of coordinating the escape. From his aircraft circling over the Eder Valley, he transmitted instructions to regroup and head west toward the relative safety of the Rhine River corridor. But the crew of each Lancaster would have to fight their own battle home. The night grew darker as the bombers left the illuminated valleys behind clouds, drifted low over the forests of Hesse and Westphalia, forcing the pilots even lower. Lancaster wings brushed treetops. Valleys appeared suddenly out of the darkness. In many cockpits, the altimeter needles hovered perilously close to zero. Any navigational error would send an aircraft crashing into unseen ground. Then came the flak. Cities along the return path, Kassel, Paderborn, Hamm, erupted with defensive fire the moment they detected enemy movement. Searchlights swept the treetops, finding occasional glimpses of the bombers. Flak shells burst with terrifying proximity, shaking the Lancasters and showering crews with shards of shrapnel. Several aircraft took hits, but the squadron pressed on. Not all would make it. Flight Lieutenant Bill Townsend, who had attacked the Sorpe Dam earlier with no result, found his path home blocked by intense searchlight coordination. His Lancaster weaved desperately, engines straining as tracers tore through the night sky. Townsend's crew survived only because they plunged into a valley at the last second, breaking visual contact with the searchlights. They reached England at dawn, fuel nearly gone. Flight Lieutenant Les Knight, the man who destroyed the Eder Dam, attempted his return flight through the same treacherous terrain he had navigated on the way in. But thick fog and rising ground forced his aircraft dangerously low. Knight barely cleared several ridges before he reached open terrain again. He and his crew landed safely hours later, with fuel tanks nearly dry. Others were not so fortunate. 3 Lancasters were lost on the return journey. Some were hit by flak. Others crashed into hillsides hidden by darkness. The toll of the mission was severe. 53 airmen killed, many of them among the RAF's most skilled and experienced low-level pilots. Back in England, the bombers that survived landed at RAF Scampton in the early morning hours. Ground crews ran to meet them, shocked by the damage: smashed perspex, bullet-riddled fuselages, flak-torn wings, shredded control surfaces. Exhausted airmen stumbled out of their aircraft, some wounded, some bleeding, all drained from hours of flying at altitudes lower than church steeples. Guy Gibson, landing last, climbed down from his cockpit after nearly 5 hours in the air. He looked hollow-eyed and pale, but alive. When the surviving crews gathered for debriefing, Gibson listened silently to each crew's report. Each loss, each narrow escape, each act of remarkable bravery. Then came the news. The Marne and Eder dams had both collapsed. The Sorpe Dam remained standing, but the destruction caused by the other 2 was immense. Massive floods swept through the Ruhr and Weser valleys. Electricity networks failed. Rail lines were washed away. Factories along the riverbanks were submerged. German industry ground to a halt for days. Reconstruction would take months, diverting crucial labor, materials, and equipment away from Wehrmacht operations. But the cost was not only military. Hundreds of civilians were killed in the floods, including forced laborers from Eastern Europe. The moral weight of these losses troubled some members of the squadron. Barnes Wallis himself, upon learning of the civilian casualties, reportedly broke down and wept. He had never intended to unleash such suffering, yet even he understood that the operation had struck a necessary blow against a brutal regime. Within days, the crews of 617 Squadron were hailed as heroes across Britain. Newspapers called them the Dambusters. Gibson was awarded the Victoria Cross. Other crew members received Distinguished Flying Crosses and Distinguished Service Orders. Yet behind the patriotic ceremonies lay the unspoken truth that every surviving airman understood. Their success had been bought with the lives of their comrades. Over the following months, 617 Squadron would evolve into a precision strike unit, conducting some of the most daring missions of the war, including attacks using the massive Tall Boy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs. But none of these later operations would ever match the unique blend of innovation, courage, sacrifice, and sheer audacity that defined the night of May 16th to 17, 1943. Operation Chastise was more than a single mission. It was a demonstration of what human determination, engineering brilliance, and extraordinary bravery could achieve when the odds seemed impossible. 2 dams fell. A third valley ran with floodwaters, and the legend of the Dambusters, 617 Squadron was born.